Well, last week was my birthday, and I turned 54 years old, and I was thinking about the last year. And I was thinking about how far I've come in 1 year. And I have to tell you, it was one of the best birthdays I've had in a long time, just because I felt good. You know, I mean, I'm looking back on where I've come from being, going through surgery and doing chemo. I mean, wow, I had days that I just didn't know how I was going to make it. I didn't know how I was going to function. I didn't know how I was going to get done what I needed to get done, but I just did it. And I have to say, it really was because of God's grace. What really was because He helped me just find the strength within to just make it another day. And wow, it was scary. There were times where I literally thought, am I going to make it? Am I going to die? Because the pain was so horrific, and the nausea and just the mental game that chemo does to you just really kind of played a warfare in my mind, or put a warfare within my mind. So it was pretty tough. But if we have the pictures, and we don't, I wanted to show you a picture of me in the hospital right after surgery. And if we'll get it, there we go. If it will stay up there for a little bit. Okay, which one? There we go. One of those screens. Well, this one here, you see, I just got out of surgery, and that's about the time Megan was allowed in. And I am completely out of it. I am just out. You see the tube down my throat. I'm intubated and still sleeping, and I will, it was just shortly after surgery. And I'll never forget when they first kind of woke me up and said I needed to wake up. I thought, oh, what did they do to me? It was like, I felt like I was turned upside down, like I was laying like this, but I wasn't. For some reason, that was in my mind. I was like laying on my stomach with my head down. I guess because there was so much pressure in here, it just felt like everything was coming this way. It was just a horrific feeling. And then the next picture just shows you kind of see the cell phone. I'm ready to work. That's kind of the spirit. Wait, stay there. You see the eyes? They look pretty doped up. I mean, but still, I was intent. I was driven to just do what I needed to do. And so this particular phone call, I'm not sure exactly what it might have been. I have an idea. But anyway, this was just a phone call that I had made to someone, and I wanted you to see that, because that was shortly after they had taken the tubes out of my throat and everything. In the next slide, you'll see kind of a collage of the recovery. Over in the left, you see, out of surgery, and then Megan was like, give me a I love you sign or communicate with me, because I couldn't really talk. This thing was down my throat, and so I just let her know that I loved her, and I was just glad to see her, and that was a precious sight, just to kind of wake up and know that I made it. It was a really good feeling. And then, of course, if you look here, you just see the recovery stages right up here. I lost a lot of weight. I got down to about 130 one time. You can see my eyes. You guys saw me on Sundays. I would just look kind of hollow, and that's because of what the medicine and the surgery and the chemo and all that did to me. It just kind of left me feeling, ugh, And then the next slide, if you look at that, you'll see me where I look more like myself, but over to the left, you'll see my scar, if you want to look at it. That is how they cut me from the top down. And it was a pretty big zipper they put in me, as you can tell. It's a pretty big. And then down below it, you see me again, pretty much coming out of surgery, intubated over the far. You see how swollen I was, just so much fluid and that kind of thing, waking up. I remember my hands feeling like I couldn't bend them, just to do the I love you was pretty, it was a chore because of how tight my fingers felt. But then as you see here, that was that picture was taken right after we had heard that, another one of our scans that said cancer-free. And so we were like, yes, everything was good. Well, those are a few of the pictures that I wanted to show you. I'm glad we got those back up. But I wanted you to see them because I wanted to remind you with some visuals that this last year has really been a year of endurance for me. I mean, it was a year where I had to continue to remind myself that I had no choice. I just couldn't give up. I had to keep going. And I knew that my life was in the Lord's hands, and I knew that when my time came to die, or when it comes to that day, I know where I'm going. But I really felt like I wanted to live a lot longer, and so I was putting my trust in God, and so I was going to do my part and let Him do His part. And so in order to do my part, I had to do what the doctor said. And there were a few pictures that I looked at, I didn't put them up there, where there was a video where Megan was helping me walk down the hall. It was the very first time she looked at me and she said, "Well, how do you feel?" And let me just tell you what I said. I said, "I feel like crap." I felt horrible. I mean, if you could imagine, you said it, I heard you, you know, you just feel like, it's like, I want you to walk from here to that door, and you think, really? Normally you wouldn't have a problem with walking from here to that door, but when you just had the type of surgery that I had, where it's, equivalent to like 10 abdominal surgeries, it's a big deal to walk from there, and back to your room. But, what he did was, the doctor gave me short goals, and then as I met those goals, I got to walk further. And I got to walk further, and eventually I would even make it up and down stairs. So it was something that I had to tell myself mentally, I don't have a choice. If I'm going to get better, I'm going to have pain, number one, and I can't have false expectations and think that it's just going to feel good. They never gave me enough medicine where I felt good. I'll tell you that much. I've heard people say, "Oh man, I was on so much medicine, I didn't even feel it." I was on a bunch of medicine, and I still felt it. And I was like, "Oh, why can't they give me more?" And they were like, "If we give you more, we might kill you." And I'm thinking, oh, it was just bad. Well, it was really the whole year and the whole experience. Looking back, it was just a horrific year, but it was a good year in the sense that I got to reflect a lot on my life and my mortality and getting things straight really in my life as far as priorities. And here I am today feeling phenomenal compared to what I felt a year ago. It's just amazing. Endurance is the ability to withstand hardship or adversity. And that's what I had to do. It was definitely hardship. It is the ability to sustain a prolonged stressful effort or activity. Well, you can sure put that across what I went through. It is the ability to keep moving or to work through stopping points. And I had to do that. I had to meet a goal, and then I had to work through that, and meet another goal, work through that, and just keep going in order to get better. And they told me if I didn't move, I might get pneumonia. And then if you get pneumonia, you could, die. And so it's like, no, I'm not going there. I'm going to do what he said, even though it hurt so bad. I can remember taking a breath hurt. Just moving your stomach just the least bit to breathe was just excruciating. Well, when we get to a place in our lives where we feel like quitting, endurance motivates us to keep going. And that's really where I was last year. When I was a kid, I used to hear the phrase, "Quitters never prosper." And you don't hear that much, but when I was a kid, your friends would use that to taunt you. "Quitters never prosper," they do that kind of thing. I don't think the kids even say that now. What? But back then, when I was a kid, there was this big deal. You don't start something and then quit. You just didn't. And when I was a kid, I grew up in some neighborhoods, and a few neighborhoods, and my time in those neighborhoods were very cherished because we got to play neighborhood sports. And back when I was young, we didn't have like cable TV, and we didn't have all the games that you got to play. I remember when Pong came out, and I thought, that is the coolest thing. Ding, ding, ding. You know what I'm saying? And you thought, this is wow. And now look at what we have. It's so real. We have virtual reality games that will just freak you out. It's so cool. Talking about cool. But when I was a kid, we didn't have those kind of things. And so you went outside as much as you could just because there was nothing to do. And of course, if you lived in a neighborhood like I did a few times in my life, we got to play outside with other friends. And occasionally we would play, sports, baseball, softball, whatever we had, football. Especially in the fall, we played football. after school, you come home, you do your work, and then, 4 or so, right before it got dark and before supper, you'd go out and you meet the other kids in the neighborhood, and you'd put a team together. If you put the team together and it happened to be in your yard, guess what? You got to be the one who picked the team. But if it was in somebody else's yard, they got to pick the team. And of course, it always worked this way. I don't care what anybody said. Whoever's yard it was in, it seemed as though they got to pick the rules too. Right? What was fair and what wasn't fair. And if they got mad and told everybody to go home, then you had to go home. But when I was a kid, you played football. We did those kind of things together. And if you didn't want to be shunned by your other neighborhood friends, you couldn't be a quitter. Like, you had to have a pretty good attitude. Like, if something didn't go your way and you didn't like the rules, you couldn't say, well, I'm just quitting and I'm going home. Because if you did, the next time there was some kind of sport going on in the neighborhood, I'll spit that out, you might not even get to play. Because they would remember the last time. They'd be like, we don't want this guy or this girl. There's no way, because they're just going to quit when they get their feelings hurt. They kind of play on all that. So you had to stick with the team. And if by chance you had a team that was really bad, and occasionally you would get one of those teams, like everybody was horrible. Well, you had, especially in football, you had to know that you were going to get a beating because they were horrible. And you had to accept it. Because if you quit, it was really a big deal. Now, the only time you could quit when I was a kid in the neighborhood, for the most part, were one of three things. One was if somebody got hurt. If somebody got hurt, you had to go get their mama or walk them to their house. You had to do something to help them, and the game was over. Or if it got dark, because like I told you, you'd start about 4 o'clock, or after you got out of school, you did your homework, and then you'd finally make it out. It was before supper, and then that's the third thing when supper came around. When supper came around, when somebody's mama called, it was time to quit. Why? Because you had to eat, and it was getting dark too, and you couldn't really see. So those were the three things that you could pretty much quit, and then the other players wouldn't get upset, and they wouldn't be all ticked with you when the next time you got together to play a sport. You had to endure. You had to be someone who stuck with it. Well, the Bible says that we were created in the image of God. It says that we were created in His likeness, and maybe that's why at an early age I had this feeling deep within that kind of understood that it wasn't good to be a quitter usually. Now, I know there are some things that it's good to quit, I understand that, but that's not what this message is about. This message is simply, what I'm talking about today is the godly character of endurance and how we can become people who refuse to quit. And therefore, and ultimately, we do prosper because we don't give up. One great example of what I'm talking about is found in a part of Noah's story. And I say a part because Noah has, some of his story is not too good, if you ask me. But there's a part of it that really is good, and it really does talk about his ability to endure. Well, close to the beginning of the Bible, when you read Genesis, you see that God ultimately gave human beings the freedom to be good or evil, to go His way or our way. And He gave us the choice because He said to Adam and Eve, there's this tree in the middle of the garden and you can't eat from it because it tells you what good and evil, and He gives the whole story, and I won't tell you all about that. You can read it yourself if you want to read it. Well, ultimately what happened was Adam and Eve, after they were created, they made the decision to eat the fruit they were told not to eat and all this other stuff. So Adam and Eve chose to go their way instead of God's way. That's ultimately what they did. Their choice resulted in what is called the fall of humanity. In other words, evil was going to begin to increase in the world, in the hearts of human beings. And it got so bad that ultimately, it got so ugly that ultimately God said, I'm not sure I like what I made. That's a pretty big deal. Look at Genesis chapter 6, beginning with verse 6. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth. You remember in the creation story where He would say, it is good, after He created things. And then when He created man, men and women and all, and it was all done, and everything was done. He said, it is very good. So he was all really something positive to him, but ultimately there came a point, because evil increased in the world and people had gotten so sinful, that he thought, what have I done? In other words, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created. Wow. And with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. God was disturbed. He was disturbed by the way men and women were living, by the choices they were making, they were continuing to make. And he was going to wipe them off the face of the earth. I know we've felt that way before, haven't we? We've seen some horrible things, and we thought, man, if I was God, I'd show them. I was God. Anybody else thought that? I've thought those kind of thoughts. But then I thought, come back to reality real quick, but I'm not God, so I can't do anything here. But God was disturbed by the way men and women were living, and he was going to wipe them off the face of the earth, but something happened. Something got God's attention. Look at chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Well, we all know that God is a God of judgment, and some people focus on that so much that they're afraid of God. They don't want anything to do with God, and they think every time you have to go to church, you got to be afraid of God. But the bottom line is that God is more than just a God of judgment. He is also a God of grace and mercy. And so the world was in bad shape. It appeared that all was lost, but yet there was one little spark of hope. And in the face of all the darkness, this one spark of righteousness got the attention of God. And this little spark, so to speak, was found in a man named Noah. Wow. This world was in bad shape. It was out of control. And there was one person who still had a relationship with God. And guess what? The Bible gives us this idea, and it tells us that God couldn't ignore that. He couldn't ignore that. There was at least one righteous, right? He couldn't ignore it. Look at verse 9. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So God noticed. That's that one little spark. One little spark in the midst of complete darkness will really shine. And God will notice. He will never see. He will always find those little sparks if they're there. He can see them, and he cares that much, even when he's totally upset with humanity. When it looked like human beings were going to be wiped off the face of the earth, God found a reason, a small one, really, not so great a one, really, but he found one nevertheless, in order to once again demonstrate salvation. You see, God is a God of grace and mercy, too. God found an old man, a really old man, named Noah. You would think there was no way he could use him. After all, he was 500 years old when God found him. I mean, if he'd found maybe, a 100-year-old gentleman, but he found a 500-year-old man, to help do what needed to be done. But yet, God chose him anyway because he saw his heart. He picked this 500-year-old man and he asked him to build a big boat that was 450 feet long, 45 feet high, and 75 feet wide. And it took him another 100 years to build it. So when he finally built it, he was 600 years old. And all this time while he was building this boat, he was telling people about this story, about what God had called him to, and they're kind of making fun of him because it had not rained, the Bible said, up until this point. Well, they had water. It would come up from the ground, dew and all that, but it hadn't rained. They didn't even know what rain was, and here's Noah, this old man, which they probably thought, this guy's a little boo-boo, Here it hadn't rained, and he's saying, you know what? God said it's going to rain 40 days and nights. And they're thinking, yeah, you're a little old there, Noah. Look at Genesis chapter 6, beginning with verse 17. God said, I am going to bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. You, your sons, your wives, their wives, your wives, their wives. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for these animals. Okay? And the Bible went on to say in verse 22, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. He did it all, just the way God had laid it out. Noah heard God's voice, and then he did what he heard. He obeyed. He did everything that God commanded him to do. Because Noah wanted to endure. The world, because of Noah, and because of his willingness to endure, the world would once again see God at work. The world would once again, when I say the world, the history of the world, so to speak, would once again hear about God being a God of grace. And like Noah, I want to be a person of endurance. And somehow, some way, my prayer is that people around me will somehow, some way see God's grace at work. Simply because I want to endure. I want to be that. I want to have that kind of character in my life. I don't want to be somebody who goes on the run when life gets tough or gets crazy. I don't want to bail. I don't want to take off and just leave town, so to speak. I want to be the kind of person who simply hears God and does what he says, and as a result, somehow, some way, people will see God and his grace. That's my prayer. They won't say, wow, man. I don't want them to go, wow, man, David's just a guy of endurance. I really want them to see beyond me. That's my hope and prayer. And see God and his grace at work. Because the only reason that I can be a person of endurance, from my perspective, the only reason I can be that is for me to cooperate with God and to do my part, but also to understand that he has a huge part to play in this, because apart from God, I can't pull it off. Throughout my recovery, there were times where I said to the Lord, I'm not strong enough. I really am not strong enough. And there were times that I really had to depend upon others to pray for me and give me words of encouragement so that I could just make it one more day. Yet I was determined, but I knew I was still not perfect, and I knew that I had weaknesses, so ultimately I needed God. I want to be that kind of person. And in the book of Hebrews, it says that we can be this kind of person. It talks about how that we can become more and more like God, in essence, of how we can become a person of endurance. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, beginning with verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. The first thing that I see here that can help us endure in this life is to remember that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We have to remember that there were people that have gone before us who have championed endurance. Sometimes we feel all alone in life. We feel like it's just us, and nobody really understands me. It's just, I wish somebody could understand me, or I wish somebody would understand how hard it is to be a person of endurance. And the truth is, there are people who understand how hard it is to be a person of endurance. And the truth is, there are people who understand what it is to be lonely. And there are people who have overcome those kind of things. There are people who have worked through those kinds of things, and they have a story. And they can tell those stories. And when we hear those stories and we tell those stories, we begin to find encouragement. And those encouraging stories seem to help us pull off what we thought we might be able to pull off. For example, the Moses story. It encourages us. It encourages me. It reminds us that we don't have to be afraid to be a leader. You know, a lot of people don't want to be a leader. I don't want to get there because then, leadership's a lonely place. But yet Moses, he did it. He didn't really want to be a leader. But then you can go on with Moses' story and say, it also helps us see that if God calls us to be a leader, we're afraid of being a leader, and we just might have to become a public speaker, then we don't have to be afraid of that either. Because a lot of times what people do is they say, okay, I'll lead, but don't ask me to talk. Talking in front of people is like, ugh. There are a lot of people who can't do that. They stand up in front of people and they go blank. And they get scared. And then they go home and they think, what did I do to myself? I know, I've been there. But we don't have to be afraid. Look at Moses. Moses said, I'm not a speaker. Don't use me. But God said, you know what? It's not about you, Moses. It's about me. I want you to be the leader, and you're going to go and you're going to speak for me. And if God calls, he'll find a way to help us